childcare.
Childcare.
Of childcare.
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 World War II began in September of 1939, sending around 16 million American soldiers to the battlefields, the majority of them being men. The war created industrial demands around the world. As men were sent to fight in the war, women were left to fulfill the empty roles in the workforce.
Eventually, there was something like 19 million women in the labor force by 1944, so at the height of the war.
Prior to the war, women's roles were typically household duties and caring for their children, and the war greatly altered their lifestyles. Children were often left on their own as mothers were unable to give them necessary attention and nourishment for their development. America needed a solution. The Lanham Act was established by the Federal Works Agency with the purpose of providing war-related public services and grants.
Some of the language in the Lanham Act was repurposed, was reinterpreted to include money for childcare as well.
Until its shutdown when the war ended, the Lanham Childcare Act had a positive effect on working mothers because it offered a safe place for children and allowed women to focus on their jobs. As the U.S. lacked options for affordable childcare, children were put in dangerous situations such as their mother's workplace.
Social workers and other community members had shared of women having to do things like leave their kids in a car or leave them home or leave them in the care of very, unprepared siblings, just so they could work.
At the centers, children had activities to keep them occupied. Toddlers could have social interactions, and these childcare centers often provided educational opportunities and medical inspections.
Quality of life outcomes and long-term social and emotional development seems to be the thing that gets impacted the most by these early care and education experiences.
Children received nurturing attention that they would not receive from their working parents. The childcare programs created jobs for teachers and childcare professionals. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote that the women knew that the children would be properly fed, given supervised recreation and occupation, and medical care if necessary. Without the distractions of watching their kids, women were able to concentrate at work knowing their child was being taken care of. Some of the most well-known child development centers were by the Kaiser shipyards in Portland, Oregon. A significant number of women were working in the shipyards, and the close proximity between their children and workplace allowed for easier commutes.
Do you know that generally the Lanham Act centers were very high quality? They had access to nurses, right, or pediatricians. They had the access to all of that sort of high quality education. The teachers were well trained and well compensated.
In addition to daily care, these centers provided meals for women and children, medical care for the kids, and enabled women to visit their children during the day. Women had begun working industrial jobs, including in factories building materials for the war. The percentage of women in the U.S. workforce increased from 27% to nearly 37%, and by 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside the home. Although women were working the same jobs that men did, they were paid significantly less.
So there were jobs that men had held previously that women took, and then there were new jobs like building airplanes or producing armaments that hadn't even existed before, and women took those jobs.
Soon after the war ended, all of the Lanham Act programs closed, including the childcare centers. Yet, other countries with similar wartime programs continued to fund childcare after the war ended. The lack of government-funded childcare is an issue that has been raised between countries since the war.
In the years since the 1940s, a lot of countries learned from that model, and a lot of countries employed similar programs, did similar national initiatives, either through direct subsidies to families so that they could pay for childcare, or in the United States, actually providing the centers.
The Great Britain Ministry of Health began providing day nurseries for the children of working women even before World War II started. European countries faced a similar situation to America with the increase of women in the workforce during the war, and affordable childcare became a necessity to support families and production. Canada opened childcare centers in response to World War II as well. The Canadian day nurseries had been created by a wartime agreement, but when the war ended, some of the provincial governments passed acts to continue the programs indefinitely. The main reason that the U.S. did not continue these programs was that both society and the government no longer recognized the need for federally funded childcare. The expectation had always been for women to return to their homes once the men were back from the war and able to work again. The common idea was that it was not right for women to take the place of unemployed men in the workforce.
We saw after the World War II centers closed, women had really enjoyed being in the workforce, had really enjoyed that accessibility of places to have their children be cared for. And it was not an exciting thing for them to have to go back to not having access to these centers and not having access to these jobs.
Women had been surveyed, and the results represented their desire to work, or at least have the option. Meanwhile, a 1943 Gallup poll showed that only a third of husbands unconditionally supported their wives' employment. The closing of the Lanham childcare centers reflected this debate about the role of women in the workforce. Governments around the world tried to discourage mothers with young children from entering the workforce. They told women that it was their patriotic duty to stay at home with their kids. Working mothers, social welfare groups, unions, and civic organizations, early childcare educators, and social workers fought to keep these programs open by petitioning and writing letters to the government. President Truman's efforts to extend federally administered childcare were unsuccessful. Women were expected to maintain their households, but this standard was unreasonable and did not take into account their preferences. While other countries were making advancements in their subsidized childcare and feminist views, America took steps backwards. Besides anger about women being able to work, some groups were against the centers themselves, as some of them had been rushed in setup. Many of the locations were not originally meant for children, and not all of the caretakers would have been qualified under normal circumstances.
The facilities were not as congenial. Maybe there was no outdoor space for the kids to play. Maybe they weren't as clean as they should have been. Maybe there wasn't as much space as there should have been. Children sometimes got sick and they had to stay home, or if the parents had to find some alternative form of care for them.
There were also groups of women who chose not to get a job during the war and stay with their kids. Although the reasoning varied, many did not want to leave their children at centers or felt that it was improper for them to work, whether or not their husbands were in the war. People were shocked that women would choose to work instead of cook, clean, and care for their children or spouse.
But as it turns out, women liked the independence, the economic independence that came with making their own money and so forth, and not having their financial well-being tied to the financial well-being of their husbands.
The Lanham Act brought much relief to mothers during World War II, so why haven't there been any more programs since then? Only 10% of mothers were working at the end of World War II, while day nurseries were provided by the government. But now, 64% of women with children under the age of 6 are in the workforce. Universal or subsidized childcare is needed now more than ever, and the success of the Lanham Act proves how it can benefit families. In fact, many childcare programs can cost more per year than in-state tuition for college. The long-term wage gap between men and women is exacerbated by the lack of affordable childcare.
In some places, hospitals often will have childcare centers for their employees the same way like the Kaiser shipyard did. And that's great. But you can't count on employers to do that.
Childcare is not only a matter of healthy children, it is one of the keys to addressing sexism in the workforce and at home. The quality of an infant's care, from social opportunities and attention to basic health measures, can affect a child for the rest of their life. In the present day, the United Nations Children's Fund, also known as UNICEF, recommends universal childcare around the globe, citing the importance of safe and high-quality nurturing and education for current and future generations.
By comparison, right, the most countries in Europe spend about 0.8% to 1% of their GDP on early care and education. The US spends 0.3% of our GDP, which is the third lowest of any nation of the sort of high income developed nations.
Additionally, President Biden's Build Back Better bill proposes universal childcare programs and free preschools. This bill could be the next step towards equality in the workforce and better conditions for youth in America. Although there hasn't been recent progress in childcare in America, there are opportunities for the country to follow the footsteps of others and build on the successes of the Lanham Act to create a better future for women and children.
So our children must be at the center of our priorities and our public policies. It is the smart thing to do, and it is the right thing to do.